Okay, great. Well, we're going to go ahead and get started. So welcome to BioGenerator. I'm Jim McCarter, Senior Managing Director. BioGenerator Ventures creates, builds, and invests in companies that are solving important challenges in human health and agriculture. We are the startup arm of BioSTL, a nonprofit that for 25 years has laid the foundation for the growing innovation economy in St. Louis. BioGenerator has invested over $50 million to help start 140 St. Louis biotech companies. Our companies have gone on to raise nearly $3 billion in follow-on funding and created thousands of jobs. We've also supported over 200 companies with office and lab space here at the BioGenerator labs in Cortex and at the Helix Center in 39 North. We are delighted that you're here today for the 11th Innovators Hour, and we hope that you'll consider joining us again in the coming months. In December, we'll host Andrew Young and Allison Mayer from Paradex, also in cancer diagnostics. And we've also begun to fill in the 2026 calendar. In January, we'll be joined by Stephen Von Rump here in the front row from Sweet Spot Digital Health. And in February, we'll have John Silva from WashU and Centiar. So search Innovators Hour at BioGenerator for our website and more information, including videos of prior conversations, which are also available on YouTube and Spotify. As nonprofits, BioSTL and BioGenerator are incredibly grateful for those who have supported us over the years, including our pillar funders that are listed on the wall behind us. And I'm excited to share that coinciding with our 25th anniversary, BioSTL will be holding our inaugural gala next year on March 5th, 2026, proceeds of which will support our work to grow the St. Louis life science entrepreneurial ecosystem. And if you're interested in that event, either sponsoring the gala or attending, please reach out to Mike Higgins. And Mike, I think you're in the back or upstairs. Mike was here earlier. M. Higgins, Higgins at biostl.org. So for today's Innovators Hour at BioGenerator, I'm thrilled to welcome the co-founders of Geneoscopy, brother-sister team, and Chief Medical and Scientific Officer Erica Barnell and CEO Andrew Barnell. So Geneoscopy is one of the most successful companies in the BioGenerator portfolio, having received FDA approval for its RNA-based colorectal cancer screening test, ColoSense, and an improved stool collection method. Geneoscopy has raised over $220 million, and its investors include strategics like Bio-Rad and LabCorp, and it was begun by two students while they were getting their graduate degrees. And so one of the fascinating things about the Geneoscopy story, as you'll hear in a minute, is that it touches on many of the institutions that make St. Louis a leader in biotech research and initiatives to build a startup culture here. So you'll hear about the Danforth Plant Science Center, WashU, Barnes Jewish Hospital, the McDonald Genome Institute, BioGenerator Labs, Arch Grants, Light Chain Capital, Mercy Health Systems, like all of these are part of the Geneoscopy story. So to get started, I'll start with a few questions for Erica about her experiences that led to the company, and then bring Andrew into the conversation. So Erica, you and Andrew grew up here in St. Louis, and while you were an undergrad at Cornell, you returned to St. Louis each summer for 3 years to do research with Mark Maneri, a WashU pediatrician focused on childhood malnutrition. And that first summer actually was at the Danforth Center, which seems a little odd in terms of how can that connect to Geneoscopy? So could you tell us about Mark's research and the work that you did with him and how that led to the early ideas for Geneoscopy?
Absolutely. So I think when I was a sophomore in college, my first big girl job was actually working in the fashion closet in New York City, Times Square, at Glamour magazine. And I was doing photo shoots with Taylor Swift and Julia Roberts and all these things, and I hated it. And so the next summer I was looking for a subsequent internship, and my uncle, who is a pediatrician at WashU at Barnes, he said, would you be interested in shucking peanuts for the summer? And I said, yeah, that sounds great. Let's go do that. So I think my second big girl job was at the Donald Danforth Plant Science Center, and I was in charge of shucking the genetically engineered peanuts that we were building and transforming so that we could increase the nutrition content for peanuts that would go into building peanut butter for ready-to-use therapeutic foods for kids in Africa. So that was the kind of impetus to my foray into scientific research, and I fell in love with it. So I started, continuing that research, and the following summer I went from the peanut butter lab to the poop lab. So, continuously escalating my glamour as I went about my career. And I then realized how much I fell in love with GI, with gastroenterology, with healthcare. And so I was doing research on micronutrient malnutrition. We were taking diapers from babies in Africa. We were looking at the biomarkers in stool samples to see if we could diagnose environmental enteropathy and predict inflammation and predict growth faltering. And that's when I kind of matriculated to the MD PhD program, which further advanced my research and initiatives. But yeah, the foundation was
fascinating. Can you go into a little more of the research findings in terms of, I know that what led to Geneoscopy around RNA stabilization and RNA isolation away from bacterial contamination, and maybe kind of, was that going on those second and third summers?
Yeah, so after I kind of finished 2 summers as an undergrad, I matriculated to the MD PhD program and completed a PhD rotation as part of kind of my education, and that's when we started developing really robust technologies to preserve and isolate RNA biomarkers in stool samples. And I realized how incredible that technology was because I spent the last 4 years realizing how unstable RNA could be. And then as I started going through my clinical clerkships, while I wasn't necessarily seeing pediatric malnutrition in the United States, I was starting to see things like IBD and IBS and colon cancer. And I actually met a woman who presented to the hospital with stage 4 colon cancer on one of my clerkships. And she was 52. She had kids. She had access to health care. And when I asked her why she didn't get a colonoscopy, she said that she couldn't take time off work, and it wasn't kind of part of her lifestyle, and she regrets it. But I felt at the time, we can sequence the genome in a day. We have all this innovative technology. We have so much at our fingertips in research, especially the things I was developing at the bench side. And so I thought, why couldn't we combine this research that I was developing and deploy it to build something for this woman to non-invasively screen for colonoscopy? And that was kind of the origin story.
Right. And so one of the things you did early, and maybe even before Andrew's involvement, was there's a student organization that's now called Sling Health, where budding entrepreneurs could kind of begin to build their ideas. And so tell us about that initiative, and then how the experience with the MBA students led you to call on your brother.
Absolutely. So, as mentioned, I'm a bright-eyed, bushy young medical student who has this grand idea, and I was very fortuitous that not only does WashU obviously support entrepreneurial endeavors, but they recommend it. And as part of that, Sling Health, which formerly was Idea Labs, was very prominent in terms of recruiting medical students to build their entrepreneurial tool sets to solve problems in healthcare. And so I joined that incubator as a first-year medical student to kind of test out this idea of Geneoscopy. And so through that, we worked with Hush Blackwell to file our provisional patent with Myers-Dill, who again was a young patent attorney at the time. Mm-hmm. Now he's incredibly successful. We built out kind of our business plan. We started doing a couple of pitch competitions, and I quickly started to realize that while I was very proficient in the science and what we needed to do from a clinical perspective to go from idea to device, people would ask me things like, can you build a pro forma statement or a cash flow statement or other words that I don't recognize, and so I'm Googling them, right? I'm like, what is a pro forma statement? And obviously before the time of ChatGPT where it would build it for me, I called on my brother. who was a JP Morgan investment banker for 2 years. I think at the time you were at Lindsay Goldberg doing private equity, about to enter the MBA program at Wharton. I was like, what better to get free advice and assistance than from somebody who I know can't say no to me. So that was kind of when I called on him to help with some of those deliverables for pitch competitions.
Yeah, that's a great handoff to Andrew. I probably don't even need to ask my question. So just.
Well, no, I was just going to say, I just had this realization that if ChatGPT existed 10 years ago, I might not be involved in this business. So I guess timing is everything sometimes.
Yeah, so as you were describing your MBA work, it sounded like every class you took was just about building the Geneoscopy business plan. And so I'm curious how you took advantage of all these opportunities and how that's carried over into the way both of you have kind of taken advantage of every opportunity, from pitch competitions to arch grants but maybe start with during the MBA about kind of how you were building the ideas for the business during your MBA.
Yeah, and I'll talk a little bit about my rationale. I spent my early career investment banking and private equity, and I'd always wanted to start a business, and my thought process was, I'll go get my MBA and spend 2 years trying to build a business, and if I fail, I can go back to the type of job I was doing before. But my whole strategy was use those 2 years to de-risk the business enough such that when I graduated, that could be my job, right? And so one of the things I learned is how many resources are available to entrepreneurs, particularly at academic institutions, whether that's just reaching out to alumni, accelerators, incubators, free funding, all those things. So I took every single class I could that was focused on healthcare, entrepreneurship, spent my whole summer here, in the building right across the street, working on the business, and then started full time in May of 2017 when I graduated. And from that point, I'm a big believer that no one can start a business by themselves, whether it's the partners, your early hires, the ecosystem, your advisors, the people that help you along the way. And I can point to 10, 15 different institutions here in St. Louis that we wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for them. And Jim mentioned a bunch of them. I think BioGenerator is a big one. From the lab space to early grants to assistance with putting together diligence packages for one of our venture funding rounds to making an actual investment later on, all of those were integral. And so, I think at every step along the way, we've tried to take advantage of every resource and every helping hand that exists.
I think that's a critical strategy as an entrepreneur and trait as an entrepreneur, that you're leaving no stone, unturned. And so, tell me more, Andrew, about the financing. So I've heard from a number of people involved in Geneoscopy, including members of your board, about your relentlessness in approaching funding. From hundreds of no's to getting to that one yes. And so just tell us about the last 10 years of this journey of keeping and getting this company funded.
So fundraising is, you don't have a business without capital, right? I'd say of the last 10 years doing this, probably 40 to 50% of my time is out raising. Even when you close one round, you're still out there at conferences talking to potential investors. And I think it's a new experience, right? It was something I hadn't done before, and you have to learn that some things are different about fundraising than other aspects of a business. One of the big ones, which you mentioned, Jim, is you get no a heck of a lot. You're going to get no 100 times for every time you hear a yes. And I think very little of that has to do with the business. It has to do with, early stage venture. There's always a risk to point to. One of the things I've learned is, you hear a lot, as soon as you get this, then I'm really interested in investing. Almost always, there is another, as soon as you get this, immediately following behind that, right? There is always, always, always something to do to continue to de-risk the business in that next hurdle. And so the only way I've found to be effective is keep talking to people, keep pitching, have thick skin. We have a number of no's that over time have become yeses. I think one of the best pieces of advice that I got early on was it's easier for investors to invest in lines than single points in time, right? I think it's Many entrepreneurs can put together a good pitch deck and give a single point in time vision of what the business can be. But if you can paint that vision, then come back 6 months later and show what you've done to achieve that vision and continue to do that over time and over time, right? Once there's multiple data points on the board, I think it becomes easier for someone to take a bet on you. So I think relentless is sort of the way you have to be, and just continuing to tell your story, refine the vision, execute and achieve milestones, and then, as you said, eventually you get a yes.
Yeah, great. And so Erica, turning back to you, so I'm curious about, and both of you can answer this, but about the early days of setting up the company. Your operations were across the street in Cortex 1 in the original BioGenerator labs before we moved into this building. I think you said you both lived in the same building in the Central West End, and you were taking classes at the med school. You had your PhD lab in the McDonald Genome Institute a block down the street, and then you'd walk over to BioGenerator. So you're running, you're working in 2 different labs. So how did you manage to lead Geneoscopy research while doing your MD and your PhD?
That's a great question. I don't remember. No, I'd say that, again, I think that I kind of came into the program knowing that I wanted to pursue this, and I had the opportunity to vet it out with Idea Labs and Sling Health. And I don't know if it was the terrible culture push from banking that led Andrew to be our full-time employee, or the pull of the good idea. But I think by the time we were 2 years in, we were like, let's do this. Let's just buckle down and make it work. And so to that end, I kind of went to my program directors and said, this is part of my education. This is what you're building MD PhDs to do, right? To bring research to patients. And so I think they recognized the value in that, and they gave me a lot of breath, and they put a lot of trust in me that I would get my classes done and do my PhD research, and allowed me to have time to kind of run up here and squat in the labs over there and do some research and feasibility studies. So I feel very grateful for that opportunity, for sure.
Yeah, and having this less than a block away from your, right?
And I couldn't have done this without the geographical incubation, the resources that we have here. You mentioned 25 years ago this was started. I was 10 at the time, right? So I think timing is everything, and to be able to walk less than a block to go from class to my PhD to finish my pipelines, and then walk another block to make sure that my reagents and everything is running appropriately in the BioGenerator labs. To be able to do that is unreal, and I think you can't really do that anywhere else.
Tell us also about the university, the collaboration with the Office of Technology Management to get a license in place, because this was unusual in that student inventions are not university intellectual property technically, but you'd also worked in the lab, and so kind of how did that conversation go, and how did OTM support you?
Absolutely, and I think, again, if I was anywhere else, I don't think this would have happened, but we basically had developed some technology under the Maneri lab, so that was kind of faculty owned, and then I further developed it through Sling Health, and then we kind of took it out of WashU, and it was very messy IP picture, and I think a lot of other institutions would have really taken advantage of that and said, well, there's a portion that was developed under faculty, so we're going to take ownership of this. But I remember somebody said, I'm in the business of making successful and wealthy alumni, and so we're gonna work with you. And it took a long time and a lot of back and forth, but ultimately we ended up buying the IP from WashU for about $1. And just as kind of a transaction. And so we actually own all the IP, and I can't wait to pay WashU back.
Yeah. But I mean, if you look at, other models of MIT and Stanford, and usually it's not the license that makes the money. Usually it's the relationship with the alums and the founders that make an ecosystem successful.
And that's the culture here at WashU. I mean, I'm so in awe of the leadership we have here, whether it was Holden Thorpe, who brought the Quick Start license to WashU, to who I was part of his kind of
With Scandalera Center.
with Scandalera Center. I was part of getting him onboarded and selecting him, and he's done a phenomenal job to, Perlmutter and everybody here at WashU who just really believes in their students and believes in entrepreneurship and what it can do for people and for patients. And I think that culture here is so important.
Yeah. So over the last 10 years, the company's grown from roughly 5 employees to 50. You've moved from Cortex to Westline, your Page and 270, where you have your own labs. So I'd be curious to both of you about what have you learned about managing a growing company? How has it changed over the years? I see the smiles. And also, how have you recruited that key talent into the company?
A couple things come to mind. One, people are really important, right? And I think managing the people in a growing organization is one of the things we spend the most time on. And I think, as I think about one of the most challenging things we've had to go through over the years, I still remember when 3 of us, or 2 of us, could sit in a room across the street in Cortex 1, and everyone was there. You could make decisions. It was easy. No one was out of the loop. I think one of the hard things as you get bigger is you need to add infrastructure. You need to add processes, and that's important. But at the same time, you can quickly see, I look at companies that have 10, 15, 20,000 employees, and our biggest advantage versus them is our nimbleness and our agility. And we've shown over time that we can, just as one example, we have an FDA-approved colorectal cancer screening test. Since that got approved about 18 months ago, we've already put several product changes and modifications through the FDA that have been critical differentiators, lowering COGS, making the test more scalable. Those are things that I think when you're a really big company can take years. We do them in months, right? But finding that balance between adding infrastructure, adding processes, putting controls around things, but still maintaining a nimbleness to be agile and to move quickly. I think that's one of the hardest parts. And then we also felt from the very beginning, I mean, Erica and I started this as 2 students. I talked about fundraising early on. No shortage of people who told us, particularly in the first couple of years, I think a little bit less so more recently, but just looked at us and said, the 2 of you can't do this. You don't have the background, don't know what you're doing, you're not the right team, right? And so I think one of the things that we did then, and I would still do today, even knowing a lot more than I did then, is go and hire a world-class team. And I think we've done a really good job of that, and just bring in people that that are smarter than you, know what they're doing in their domain expertise, whether that's commercial, software, product development, quality, regulatory, because that's the way you're going to scale, right? You can't scale an organization with the 2 of us. You need to scale an organization by building a great team. So I think those are some of the things that we thought about.
I'll just add that, even as 2 kids with an idea, culture was paramount for us. It was the fabric of Geneoscopy, and we've built a foundation of culture that I think has scaled. And even when we go from, 1 room to many rooms and 50 people, we have a very flat organization. We have a ton of transparency. Everybody knows why they're doing something, what they're working on, what we're working towards. Andrew's a just unbelievable leader when it comes to be able to listen, to be deferential, to not have any amount of ego, and be able to kind of look at the big picture and take in that feedback and make decisions that are strategic. And I think that is so important, and been one of the reasons we're incredibly successful on a lot of the building and scaling fronts.
Curious to turn attention to clinical proof. And so, for a diagnostic, you have to have patients and patient samples, and you have to prove the sensitivity and specificity of your test. And this is a huge expense, and you had to do this at a massive scale. You did this with a decentralized trial. So maybe if you can all frame as you were thinking about this trial, what was on your mind as to the barriers that were going to make this trial so expensive and hard to do, and how did you solve that, and how was decentralizing the trial part of it?
I'll maybe start, and then I'll pass it to Erica. Simply, sometimes, necessity is what drives the innovation, right? We didn't come up with this great idea for a decentralized clinical trial and go do it, right? We were two young entrepreneurs, and we had a certain amount of capital to run a really big study that often takes a lot longer and often requires a lot more money, right? And so one of the things that the decision we made is we had to find a better way to do it, right? We needed to find a way that it didn't take 6 years like it took other companies. It didn't take $400 million like it took other companies. And so we came up with a solution. The solution was a decentralized clinical trial where you don't go and set up fixed sites. You don't use project coordinators on site to enroll patients. You find people online. You send them the kit at home. You let them go to any gastroenterologist they want. And the result was we did the clinical study, our pivotal clinical study, for a fraction of the cost and at about a third of the time of similar studies that we've seen out in the industry. And so that was a game changer for us. I'll maybe let Erica talk a little bit more in the weeds because what she did to design that was incredibly innovative.
Yeah, so basically over the course of 12 months, we used social media to engage with patients online. And we had over 273,000 individuals take a survey to determine enrollment or eligibility. We enrolled 14,000 patients in 12 months. You wouldn't believe how much poop is in my lab, just like poop everywhere. And that's a great thing, right? So for me, we were able to kind of, again, recruit patients in a non-invasive way that was very integrated in their lives. We shipped them a collection kit, decentralized, just showed up at their door. We called them up. We had them ship it back, and then we navigated them to go complete a colonoscopy. 63% of patients had never before been screened for colorectal cancer, did not have a colonoscopy scheduled at the time of enrollment, which is in direct contrast to these site-based models where you spend hundreds of thousands of dollars just to set up sites where patients already have a colonoscopy scheduled. So we're not only reaching the intended use population that we want to engage, people who are adverse to colorectal cancer screening, but we're doing it at a way less expensive price in a shorter duration of time, and we got the exact same indication as other companies that spent much more than us. And I think to that end, we've now built the infrastructure to navigate patients to colonoscopy. So when we're moving from a research phase to a commercialization phase, we're leveraging that same infrastructure for patients that have a positive colosense test to bridge that gap and actually get them a colonoscopy, which is paramount for kind of closing the gap of comprehensive screening.
So in parallel with that, you've got the regulatory strategy and the early discussions with the FDA, and the clinical study has to align with what the FDA is looking for. So I'm curious to hear kind of the evolution of the regulatory strategy and those conversations with FDA that eventually led to the approval.
Absolutely. So I looked at it, and exactly 10 years before, no, it was 8 years before we got FDA approval, the day that we got FDA approval, within 3 days of that was my first outreach to the FDA, to the head. I cold called the head of the CDRH and just sent her an email. I'm like, hi, I'm Erica. Here's my phone number if you need to reach me, right? This woman is not calling me, but
She did respond.
She did respond. She was like, here are the appropriate mechanisms to engage with the FDA.
You did this wrong.
I'm not calling you, but you can submit a pre-sub. And I think a lot of people are very anxious, nervous, scared to talk to the FDA. But I always say, they're just very nice, nerdy people who are following a set of rules that they've published. And if you've read the rules and you engage with them by not sending them your phone number and email, but just by submitting a pre-sub, they'll answer anything that you have to ask. And they're so willing to help, and they love entrepreneurs, and they love students. So I'd say, talk early, talk often. There's definitely strategy about what you share, what you don't share, and speaking with consultants about that is important, but it should not be a scary institution. And I really encourage people to kind of engage early, because one of the reasons that we were able to actually do this decentralized trial was because we kind of got the green light, a soft green light from the FDA, and they're like, we'll see what happens, but sounds good, go for it.
Do you want to add to that?
Maybe the only other couple things I would add is it does take a while, right? From the time you submit it, your meeting with them might be, it's usually about 6 months away, right? And you need to prepare it. And so getting to that early, right? You don't want to get into your clinical study. You want to have everything agreed upon, right? When we went into our clinical study, we had, I think it was 24 analytical studies where we'd agreed upon the endpoints for every one, how many patients, how many replicates, and we'd agreed in broad strokes on the design of the clinical study as well as the primary endpoints. So, and that actually took 3 pre-subs over the course of several years, right? You don't often get it, some of the things you propose, they don't say yes to, and they're not going to say, no, do this instead. They just say no, and then it's on you to go back and repropose something new, right? And I would also say, you got to find, one of the things I've learned is there is a particular way to frame content, to frame questions for the FDA to get, if you ask the question wrong, it's not that you're going to get the wrong answer, you're going to get a not helpful answer, right? And so, now we have this expertise internally, but having the right consultants to make sure you're framing the questions in the right way and asking the right questions, that's important as well.
Yeah. So Geneoscopy is a fast follower in that you're bringing a product to market, ColaSense, where there's already one product on the market, Cologuard from Exact Science. In fact, coincidentally, for those of you who haven't checked the news today, it was announced that Exact Science was acquired for $23 billion by Abbott Laboratories, my former employer. And so what are the disadvantages and advantages of being a fast follower?
Yeah. One of the things I think is one of the things we've heard and we very much believe in is, addressing something like screening in a broad population with 100 million people that need to be screened and 40 million people aren't, is it takes a village, right? It takes a lot of different types of tests with different profiles, with different attributes. And I think back to when we were starting this company, the Cologuard product was already on the market and seeing traction. And as we were doing diligence on the diagnostic space in general, there were 2 things that we had identified as things that typically trip up a diagnostic test. It's usually, can you get insurers to cover and pay for the test? And can you get clinicians to understand how they fit into the clinical workflow? Erica always says, just because you measure something doesn't mean it's actually valuable or useful. And so one of the things that was de-risked very early on by the presence of another test in the market is some of those things have been proved out. Physicians had shown that they wanted non-invasive colorectal cancer screening tests. Insurers were paying for it at the time. Medicare had already covered, and there was a rapidly growing number of commercial payers who adopted. And so part of the thought process was, if we can go into a market, because there were a ton of things that we wanted to target and are still targeting with our platform. But we chose to be a fast follower and focus on building new markets later because we felt that if the key things of getting the test paid for, do physicians want it, if those were already de-risked, we thought the story for investors, the ability to underwrite the investment, would be better. I think we were right about that. The time it's taken us to go from, and some of what I was talking about was just the regulatory pathway as well. We were able to start from somewhere who'd already gone through a pivotal study. So our ability to be a fast follower and get to market quickly, start to see real milestones of adoption, coverage, guideline inclusion, we've taken advantage of all of those, right? It's taken us less capital, less time, and so that's all a positive. No business strategy is perfect, right? I think the drawback of being a fast follower is you have someone in the market who might not want you in the market, right? And if they're a big company that has a large sales force, a lot of capital, that can be used to try to keep you out of the market. And obviously you need to have even stronger differentiators to come and say, not just use this product when you're not using anything today, but use this product, here are the attributes that my product has that might be different or unique for certain patient populations or for patients who are unscreened. So I think it is sort of a double-edged sword. There's certainly benefits and there's certainly incremental challenges of being a fast follower.
And do you want to say a little more about, the acquisition price of $23 billion maybe took some people by surprise. So maybe a little bit about, there's some venture capitalists who don't invest in diagnostics because they say it's not a big enough market and that therapeutics is where their money should be going. And, tell us more about kind of how you see diagnostics as an important area.
Yeah, I think going full circle back to the fundraising topic at the beginning, I think some of us folks fundraising and building diagnostics companies, you often look at the therapeutics or the pharma space, and it seems that they get all the money and they have all the big exits. But the reason so much venture goes into pharma is because historically there's been a clear willingness to pay for drugs when they get FDA approved, to prescribe drugs because our healthcare system is set up to be much more reactive, right? If you're sick, we'll pay a lot to give you something to treat it. We don't do as good of a job as giving you things that keep you healthy. And as a result of some of those dynamics, there's often liquidity for investors that put money into early biotech. There's a lot of buyers, and there's typically a much more robust IPO market, right? So I think when I see something like this acquisition, I do think in the last few years, and I think some of this stemmed from originally with COVID, I do think there's an increasing understanding of the value that diagnostics can bring. I do think some of it started with COVID. We saw the COVID testing. We're now seeing the introduction of multi-cancer early detection, a lot of traction there. MRD testing has taken off, and then obviously in our space, screening as well. And so I think we are seeing a broader appreciation for what diagnostic tests can do clinically. What that means is they get prescribed more, they get paid for more. And I think ultimately transactions like that showing that there's a market for building these types of companies that deliver a lot of value can only help because it drives more investment, more innovation, because we need a lot more companies, I think, like ours, that do similar things and can help patients.
Right. Erica.
I also think it's reflective of a cultural shift and a societal shift where, 50 years ago, patients say, I'll do what my doctor wants me to do. They trust in the doctor, and I think today, we've given a lot more autonomy in the hands of patients. Patients want more information. They have more access to their records. They have more access to their data. We have records. We have Roe. We have telehealth. We have Hims and Hers. All of these direct-to-consumer avenues and the ability to access medical education more readily has created a pull from patients to engage in more preventative medicine, engage in more diagnostics. And I think while insurers traditionally have been unwilling to kind of pay for that preventative care or invest in that preventative care, I think patients are now kind of demanding it.
Right.
And that's been a big shift in terms of innovation and investment in diagnostics.
Can you say, staying on diagnostics, can you say more about your pipeline of things other than, because it's not just ColoSense. You've got a pipeline of products.
We do. So I'm an inflammatory girl by heart. Started in environmental enteropathy. So I have been very excited to pivot from oncology back to my inflammatory roots. And so while ColoSense is moving towards commercialization and we're building, innovating around that product, I started thinking about what's next. And I really see a massive unmet need in IBD, inflammatory bowel disease, which includes ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease. And specifically, I think all the oncologists have the fun tools, right? We have Foundation Medicine. It's basically malpractice if you don't have Oncotype DX or some other type of genetic testing when an individual's diagnosed with cancer. But in IBD, they're still really throwing spaghetti at the wall. And they're basically prescribing biologics based on if insurance is going to cover it. And there's no direction from a molecular standpoint as to which therapy would be efficacious. So we're going to be launching our IBDX product, which is hopefully going to be assisting physicians and gastroenterologists in dictating which therapies are efficacious for IBD so they can more effectively prescribe therapies that are more likely to work.
Excellent. So I have sort of one last question before we turn to the audience, and that is curious about running a startup company with your sibling and what that dynamic is like and how that's evolved over the decade.
I can start. I mean, I think the most important thing for me, one, I would say I don't think I could have started a business by myself. I think there are plenty of solo entrepreneurs out there. I think I'm the type of person that needed a partner. And as I think to having a partner and starting a business, the most foundational thing for me is trust, right? I think you need someone who you can trust implicitly as an equal partner with you there. You know, you go through a lot of ups and a lot of downs starting a business. I mentioned this earlier, but there truly is a new challenge every single day around every turn. Sometimes they surprise you, right? And so having someone that you truly trust and can rely on to go through those things, I think it's critical. I think when you have a sibling, you know, I think we've had a great relationship going all the way back to when I was in 9th grade and she was in 7th grade. Before that, it wasn't as great, but and so we had that, right? I think that was there from the beginning, and I think that was such a nice starting place to be partners in building this business. And I think it also incrementally helped that we have very different domain expertises. But you know, I think that was one of the critical things for me.
Yeah, I think from, you know, domain expertises being complementary to our personalities being very complementary. I think I call him a neutral Nancy. You know, he always says it's never as good as it seems, it's never as bad as it seems, and I'm kind of much more volatile and you know, swing with the ebbs and flows of entrepreneurship. And I think, you know, that rock, he keeps us very grounded, but I can kind of get behind anything and bring that optimism and you know, just be really excited and passionate and making sure that we kind of keep trudging along. And I think that skill set is very complementary too, and especially in the times when it inevitably ebbs. I think, you know, both of us are able to recognize each other even before we say anything and know what the individual needs and wants. And I think having that trust, having that bond has been inordinately helpful to kind of get through some of those low points for sure.
Yeah. So Christy Alteber, who's, by the way, she's the head of BioGenerator Labs, so she runs this facility. So she's got the mic, and we'll find you. So let's turn to the audience for questions, but first join me in thanking Erica and Andrew for being with us today. So raise your hand if you, oh, here we have one in the front row. I think Dave has a question.
Thank you. Whether ChatGPT or Claude or Grok or Copilot, are you using AI in your business for research, for example, and are you maybe doing it to frame the questions and ask the questions in the right way when it comes to the FDA?
If you're not using AI, you're behind. I mean, I even asked AA, like, what do I need to watch to learn more about you? You know, like, you just need to keep staying up to date on the advancements. And we even were talking to our marketing director this afternoon. He's like, the image generation, he's like, these images we generated 45 days ago, and now when you try to do the same thing, it's just exponentially improved, which is insane to think that you're outdated after 30 days of improvement with these systems. And so just even automating the learning of what's happening is something that I think is very important, and integrating it into your everyday life. So I use it every day, ranging from like make me a coloring page for my kid to you know, brainstorming on the next big project or framing our questions for the FDA. Yeah, compliance questions, legal stuff. It just completely mitigates cost and streamlines your day.
We have one in the front row and then two behind you there, Chris. Let's start in the front row, and then we'll do the two back behind you there.
Hey, thank you for your time. My name is Chris Pulliam, and throughout the talk, you guys mentioned ways you've innovated the work process to help de-risk as you moved on. Can you both give maybe one of the key steps you used to de-risk the very early stages as both the scientific officer and executive officer?
I can start. I would say I often look at other businesses, my friends who've started businesses, for example, in the software space. And I think there's always something to envy about different industries. I do think one of the challenging things with life sciences is that it is capital intensive, right? You know, you can't do a study for a couple $100. Like even with ChatGPT, if you need clinical samples, right, ChatGPT can't make clinical samples for you. I mean, maybe we'll get there. So she'll disagree with me. But I do think that was one of the things that we struggled with, right? We needed to raise external capital really, really early, right? And you need to raise a lot of capital. It leads to dilution. But in some ways in life sciences, when you talk about the necessary generation of clinical data, when you talk about having to build a quality system, the time it takes for this stuff, right? A lot of the capital consumption from a business is just that you can't do stuff in 3 months. It takes years, right? And so I think, to a certain extent, I think it's unavoidable in the life sciences space to a certain extent. But I think we did try really, really hard. I mean, I remember the very first study we ever ran was 12 patients. And we got stool samples from a biobank in Ukraine. And Erica and I put in a little bit of money ourselves. And because the first question we were getting was, can you really extract RNA from stool samples? I don't think you can, right? 12 samples, proved we could do it, put it on a slide, and we had data, right? And so, I think that was an example of something we did, but I think maybe the piece of advice I would give is try to be laser focused on, I think there's always shiny objects to chase or fun experiments to run to this, that, the other thing. I think one of the benefits of talking to a lot of investors and doing your research, and maybe some of this can come from ChatGPT, is what is truly the thing that does de-risk the business? Like, what is the thing that you need next, often with life sciences, to raise your next round of capital, right? And so I think if you get really laser focused on what exactly that is, and don't do something that's unnecessary, don't do something that's incremental, that can help. And then just trying to be innovative to find a way to do it cheaper.
And I'd say don't guess, right? Go pitch and be like, can you give me money now? And they'll say no, because you don't have data to demonstrate that you can isolate RNA biomarkers from stool samples. And then you go back, we put in money, did the study, and we went back to that same investor 4 weeks later, or whatever, and said, look, I did what you asked me to do. Now what? And they'll give you something else until they run out of excuses, and then they'll write you a check. So, I think be like relentless with that approach.
Either one of the two folks, yeah. And then I think we'll do, and then Jim next, and then there's one in the further back. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm Wang. So I have a question for Erica. So you started with you going from the colonoscopy to the genetic testing, right? So when your product is launching or when you're developing, so how do you close the gap between the clinical scientists and all laboratory technicians, this knowledge, and how do you making commercialization, or how do you do this testing more in the hospital, and how do you closing these gaps with traditional and genetic testing? Yeah.
In terms of getting our tests to laboratories or to patients?
Yeah, so laboratory to patients also, do you training the clinical laboratory scientists, do you this testing, or are you doing by only yourselves?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So our FDA submission was a single site PMA, pre-market approval. So we are the only facility in the country that can run ColoSense. But again, because we leverage this decentralized recruitment model, we have a lot of data to demonstrate that we can have collection kits shipped to patients and sent back to us and process them to fruition, and then ultimately navigate patients to colonoscopy if they have a positive test, which is the kind of end-to-end solution. So we have kind of proved that out with the clinical validation study. We've also have a strategic partnership with LabCorp. Andrew mentioned one of our bigger investors is going to be distributing the test, and we're going to leverage their sales force mostly for engaging with primary care physicians so that they can order the test on LabCorp portals.
I'd maybe add something a little incremental that surprised me about building the business. If you'd asked me on day one 10 years ago, I would have said, yeah, you need the data, and then you need to run a study, and then you go commercialize the test, right? I think one of the things that's been amazing is all of the infrastructure you need to build around just the clinical data. I mean, people did look at us and say, you're crazy for taking on a PMA as a class 3 device as your first product, and so that was a choice we made. You can certainly go a less regulated pathway, but a lot of that infrastructure building that's now enabling the launch of the test was not necessarily just the data, right? It was building the quality system. It was building the technology. A lot of people say in diagnostics, like, oh, I have to go build a CLIA lab. And I think people think that means I need to put a building together and have 4 walls and have lab desks. So little of the CLIA lab is the actual physical space. It's all of the SOPs and the procedures and following the regulations. That's the hard part, right? And then the LIMS system to run it all and to have the sample chain of custody, right? And the software, right? All of that infrastructure you have to build. At the end of the day, we're a service business, right? We're a diagnostics lab. And so it amazed me how much has to go into simply being able to deliver a test result to a patient, which truly after 8 years, the first time we got an order for ColoSense, delivered a clinical result, it really felt like something special because of all the work that had gone into it, and a lot of that was beyond the clinical data.
Jim.
All right, I have a 2-pronged go-to-market question. One is how do you overcome the challenges where an endo suite in the GI space is highly profitable, and you're offering a solution that would potentially move them away from the number of procedures there. So that's one. How do you go around that? Maybe it's the lab partnership. And an expensive direct-to-consumer marketing is very difficult. And then on the positive side, with Medicare Advantage and the majority of seniors on a Medicare Advantage plan right now, where preventative, non-invasive methodology is perfect, obviously, how do you capture that share quite quickly in some of your larger value-based organizations?
Yeah. So it's been an interesting, having been doing this for the last 9-10 years, it's been an interesting evolution in the gastroenterology community. Now, most colorectal cancer screening tests are prescribed by primary care physicians, but gastroenterologists are the key opinion leaders, right? So I do remember speaking to gastroenterologists 7-8 years ago, particularly more community physicians. You know, the academics have always been excited about non-invasive screening, but, you know, a lot of them would look at you 8 years ago and say, get out of my office, you're gonna put me out of business, right? And I think things have evolved a lot in the last decade. We've lowered the screening age from 50 to 45, so there's now 20 million more people in the screening population. The number of gastroenterologists is not increasing, it's actually flat to decreasing. And there's 40 million people today that are supposed to be screened and are unscreened. And so I think there's been this realization among gastroenterologists that there's not the base of gastroenterologists to screen the whole market, and non-invasive tests can actually be a tool that they can use to get lower risk people screened and then funnel patients with positives who are now higher risk and have a much higher yield of adenomas and cancer to the colonoscopy, where not only are they doing more good, but they get paid more for those procedures, and there's only so much they can do to continue to do more scopes in a day, right? And so I think today there's a little bit of it's a little bit more of a symbiotic relationship, and I think it's a positive for the way the market's developed, right? The way screening should work should not be an invasive procedure. It should be a cheap, at-home, non-invasive test, and then you funnel a high-risk population to a more non-invasive diagnostic procedure like colonoscopy. To your question about commercialization, I would say our strategy is in line with the question around being a fast follower, right? I think one of the things that we firmly believe, if you look around the country at this point, there's almost not a primary care physician, an NP, a gastroenterologist who hasn't prescribed a non-invasive stool-based test, right? And so that's a very different landscape than going out there and saying, hey, for the last 3 decades, you've been prescribing colonoscopy, now I've got this great new stool test for you, right? And so I think there are unique things we can do as a fast follower. One of them is partnering with someone like LabCorp. So LabCorp is a partner of ours who's gonna help us with ease of ordering, so integration into EMRs, making it really easy for physicians, direct detailing, and then also kind of the billing piece from a market access perspective. So just one of the ways we're trying to be efficient in a market where the category is well known, but our product, it actually is well known today, but needs to be more well known.
I would just add that medicine is evidence-based, and there was a landmark study that was published, the Nordic study, that actually showed that colonoscopies can truly be detrimental in a screening population. You know, there's risk of perforation and bleeding and even death, which is not something you get with a poop test. So I think that, to Andrew's point, not only is the base recognizing that they can't service the 120 million Americans that require screening, but there are drawbacks to colonoscopies, and that gap can be filled by non-invasive testing.
Yeah, this will be the last question unless there's another. Are there other questions after this one? One in the front. So let's do two more. One in the back and one in the front here.
Hi. You said you recruited patients for your first clinical trial over social media. I was curious about if you use targeted advertising to recruit those patients, and how, both from the business side and from the scientific side, you built a profile of your ideal patient for the trial.
We definitely did. And that landscape has super changed as well. Actually, there's a lot of compliance and legal things around targeting and demographics and things like that. But, you know, like Florida is, everybody in Florida is like over 45. So, you know, you just kind of target your markets there. But I'd say, you know, we did a lot of A/B testing. We did a lot of trial error. I have my favorite poop-eating heart man. That's kind of our logo for our original study and for our post-approval study. But yeah, there's a lot of art, I'd say, in marketing and engaging, and it's just trial and error and seeing how many, you know, which poop-eating heart man gets the most clicks, which, you know, how much money. We did a ton of testing on how much money we'd offer patients, and, you know, what's the value add versus the detriment from spend. So in the same way that we did research for defining the biomarkers, we did the same thing with the decentralized recruitment. And being a small, innovative company, we could pivot really quickly. So if this wasn't working, you know, let's try something else. And there was very little that prevented us from being nimble and agile in that front.
And I would say a decentralized clinical trial is not for every application, right? I think a lot of times you need to look at, what is my product, how does it work, what is the best way to validate it. But in a world where every person in the country who is 45 years or older could be enrolled, and we have a non-invasive collection kit that can be done at home, and there's thousands of endoscopy centers in the country, and, you know, endoscopies are done every single day, and just, there are complications, but largely considered a safe and reliable and straightforward procedure. That lended itself incredibly well to a decentralized clinical study.
Mm-hmm. All right, you had a question, this last question.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I have a question for the early stage when you pitch to the investors. Like, how did you build your pitch deck? Because you mentioned the diagnostic is it's not as popular as therapeutics, and especially when you're working on very early stage, how did you sell your product? Like, because the investor, they're like profit driven. Like, how do you sell your idea and tell them, like, convince them that this is profitable? And for like people who are fundraising now, do you have any like investors you think they should go talk to?
I'll maybe start with a couple things. So one, there's certainly plenty of templates online that say, hey, in your pitch deck, it should be these 10 slides, right? And so I think there's some of that. I would say our pitch deck has evolved over time. We're updating it constantly. I look back at our pitch decks from 2014, and, you know, we had some things that were wrong, right? So some of it's iterating based on feedback, as Erica mentioned. I've always felt like there are 3 things you really need to nail in a pitch deck, which are, what's the problem, what's my solution, and then what traction do I have, right? I've always found the biggest thing that our investors are looking for is, what have you achieved? Like, what have you done recently that shows this is gonna work, right? I mean, for us today, it's volume and orders and coverage. In the past, it was clinical studies and IP, right? But there's always something that investors are looking for that says, this is gonna work, right? And so those were always the 3 things, but you can find plenty of templates. There's a bunch of other things like competitors and all those sorts of things. In terms of finding investors, the way I always did it was, you know, the landscape of diagnostics investors is relatively narrow. But if you're not a molecular diagnostics company, your investors are going to be totally different. So what I always did was go look at the portfolios of various investors. And if they have companies that look like yours, look for a LinkedIn connection to someone at the firm and ask for a warm introduction. I think warm introductions are always the best if you can find them, and especially if you're early stage. I would say one of the other learnings I would have is I do think that sort of seed, angel, maybe up even into Series A, tend to want to invest local, right? I think we have a lot of investors on the coast now. A lot of those folks didn't come in until our Series B and our Series C. A lot of our early funding was from the community here. I think one of the growth areas for St. Louis as a venture ecosystem is having early stage funding. But I would start local, whether that's angels, whether that's the seed funds and the Series A venture firms. There's a bunch of them in the life sciences space, but those would be some of the things that kind of come to mind.
Great. I think that's a good place to stop. Thank you again both so much for coming. Yeah.
Thank you.